Maikwestahoven, Nuninian, Net Nikich Pus Borshart, Net Paiute and Ute. Good afternoon, my friends. My name is Nikich Pus Borshart Campbell, and I am Paiute and Ute, born and raised in Cedar City, Utah. And I am currently in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm the executive director of the National American Indian Court Judges Association. Just a little bit about NIJA and my role there is NIJA is a membership organization for tribal court judges that's been in existence since 1969. Its primary purpose and mission is to support and enhance tribal justice systems. And it's doing that through a variety of ways, but primarily through education, advocacy, and information sharing, which is why I'm here. Our judges and those who are members of our association definitely understand that the issues affecting our communities do not happen in silos, and that it's really interconnected, and also that our justice system is expanded beyond just our court judges and our court system personnel. So we include supporting justice system capacity building to include all the system stakeholders, tribal councils, the tribal law enforcement, and those service providers who are also providing treatments to the individuals who are coming before the bench. And we also include the attorneys, the prosecutors, and those legal aid attorneys and representatives who represent juveniles and other indigent defendants in front of tribal courts. So that being said, I am really honored to be here to help introduce this panel related to promising practices in juvenile justice. So first off, we have Professor Addie Rolnick of UNLV's William S. Boyd School of Law, and then she'll be followed by Annette Levia and Johanna Farmer from Pascoyaki, and they will be talking about their attendance achievement program. And following Annette and Johanna, we have Dave MacArthur and Ty Warren talking about the White Earth Nation's Tribal Healing to Wellness Court. And then finally, we'll have Anna Rangel, who's the director of the Tribal Law Policy Division of the OJJDP TY Training and Technical Assistance Center. All right, we'll begin with Professor Rolnick.
My name is Addie Rolnick. I am a professor at UNLV School of Law, and I just flew in. I've never just flown in before a panel, so I'm glad that I made it. I have the most boring job, which is to kind of lay the groundwork and talk about jurisdiction. There's a lot more interesting things to talk about, and I'm looking forward to hearing. So the question that comes up after thinking about the problems and the jurisdictional issues is sort of what are promising practices, and in terms of data, sort of data-tested practices, there really aren't any to report on. So the most interesting part for me is to hear from everyone who actually has programs that seem to be working well, who can talk about those. So I just want to lay the groundwork for sort of the backdrop. So I write about juvenile delinquency in Indian country, and I've been doing it thinking about it in some way for more than a decade. What I'm going to say boils down to two things. One is tribal governments have more power over this than they might think. And the second thing is stop using that power to lock up kids and try to do other things. That's the gist of what I'll tell you. So starting with jurisdiction, I'm thinking about Native youth, and I'm going to start by thinking about what I'm going to call tribal youth. So what I mean is that's going to be anyone who falls under tribal jurisdiction. I'll tell you in a minute the different people that might fall under that. So the tribal government has jurisdiction over any Native youth, any tribal youth who commits a juvenile offense on tribal land as long as tribal law covers it. So this is usually when we talk about jurisdiction, criminal and juvenile, we start with federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction, and then we end up kind of saying, well, here's something that nobody else is covering, so let the tribes do that. I would encourage you to think the other way about it, which is to say, let's think about what the tribe has power over, and then if there are other jurisdictions that are also involved, let's see where they fit in. So if we do that, it turns out that the tribes have jurisdiction for juvenile delinquency over basically everybody who is a Native youth in Indian country. Now, it doesn't necessarily include non-Native youth, but that's not the topic that we're concerned about here, and it doesn't necessarily include people outside of Indian country, although it could. So what I mean by this, then, thinking about just kind of some of the wrinkles of it, who's going to count? So that depends on what your criminal and juvenile and constitutional law says about who counts as a amenable to your jurisdiction. So for a lot of tribes, it's going to be tribal members, and it'll be just based on citizenship, but it doesn't have to be that. So some tribes will define it more broadly. Sometimes it will be whoever counts as an Indian under federal law. Some tribes have done it without a requirement of Indianness, so just saying we have jurisdiction over anyone on our land. And they wait to see if anybody is going to fight that. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and the important thing is that the tribal law extends the jurisdiction far enough. So the first thing to do then, if you're thinking about either changing or building a system, is to make sure that the tribe's law reaches as far as possible. And then anyone who commits an offense on tribal land, definitely anyone within Indian country. Arguably, there's some case law that supports the idea that any tribal land, not just Indian country. So if your tribe defines its territory as a little bit different than federal law defines Indian country, then arguably your jurisdiction extends to what the tribe's law says, not what the federal law says. And there's actually a circuit court case in the criminal context upholding tribal jurisdiction over a tribal citizen outside of Indian country. So this may even go beyond Indian country in some cases. So the tribe has lots of power here. The federal government is also going to be involved. So the federal government has jurisdiction over Native youth who commit major crimes and Native youth who victimize non-Native people in Indian country, and also Native youth who commit federal crimes. So if it's otherwise an interstate federal crime not related to Indian country, they would still have jurisdiction there. That is an overlay over tribal jurisdiction. So the tribe has jurisdiction, the federal government sort of comes in on top. The exercise of federal jurisdiction does not have any effect on the exercise of tribal jurisdiction, and unfortunately, in a lot of areas, I don't think the prosecutors are talking to each other, so it might be that we don't even know whether one is prosecuting or the other, or they both are. So an effective system would involve some balancing of responsibility between federal and tribal, but there's no requirement in law that they talk to each other. In places in which Public Law 280 or something like Public Law 280 is in effect, it's going to be the state government who has jurisdiction over Native youth instead of the federal government. But again, the tribe is still the one at base. So the question is, who is the overlay? Is it state or is it federal? But not whether the tribe has jurisdiction. The tribe is going to have jurisdiction in every case. What matters is that how they work with the other governments and the laws that would need to change to improve that relationship are going to be different depending upon if it's state or federal. And then I want to focus on Indian country, and I think that's what we're going to talk about here today. But the state government is then going to have jurisdiction over all youth who commit offenses outside of Indian country. Whether or not the tribe can argue that it does, the state definitely will. And so there is a big piece of this. It's more than half of Native youth who are under delinquency jurisdiction in the country are under state jurisdiction because they're outside of Indian country. So this is not a small population of Native youth. It should be an area of concern, but we don't address that area of concern necessarily by starting with tribal jurisdiction because these kids are already in state systems. But everyone likes a chart about jurisdiction, and so here it is for thinking about juvenile jurisdiction. It looks just like a criminal jurisdiction chart for the most part. The reason tribal is in red is because I want you to see that except for when offenses occur somewhere else, it's the tribe that's involved in all of that. So we don't care for most of the purposes of today who the other sovereign is. The tribe is always involved at often the first one involved. So thinking about tribal jurisdiction, though, what I have found, and the data on this is really bad, and so I give you numbers, but I would like you to take them with a grain of salt because I get them and then they change and no one seems to have the real numbers. But it seems like there's a lot of secure incarceration of juveniles under tribal jurisdiction. So when I used to work at a law firm and did lobbying related to this, and a lot of the tribal leaders that I worked for would say that they didn't want to lock up their kids. I also used to work with tribes building juvenile courts. They said the same thing. But it turns out that what the system in Indian country looks like, the tribal jurisdiction system, is basically jails. And so just to give you some idea, so this is based on the Jails in Indian Country reports, and they don't do a very good job of releasing much about the data. So I do things like I go through the list of facilities and I count which ones have juvenile in their name, and that's how I know how many facilities there are. And there's, amazingly, there's not a place in which there is a person who knows the actual number. So there's a data problem with this, but the best that we can figure out so far, so over the last 15 years or so, the number of juveniles confined in detention facilities, this is based on what I'm using here as a one-day count, so when they come in and count in the middle of June to see who's there, has declined from around 300 a year in the period of 88 to 2002 to around 250. From 2007 to 2012, it was pretty consistent, and in 2016, it's 170. So the number of juveniles in incarceration has gone down. At the same time, a couple of things that are interesting. One is that girls, so I just started last year to try to break the numbers down and look at girls particularly, and most of the time girls are really small. For most groups, they're a very small proportion of the juveniles who are in the system, and especially the ones who are locked up. So what it looks like is that the number of boys in detention has gone down, but the number of girls has stayed basically the same. So whereas they used to be consistently less than half, since 2013, girls have been more than half of the kids in detention facilities in Indian country. So it's more than 50% female at this point. So contrast that with federal jurisdiction. There's almost no girls in the federal system. So there's I think under 200 a year in the federal system, so Indian country kids who come under federal jurisdiction, and less than 5 of those, maybe less than 2 are girls every year. So there's very few girls going into the federal system, but a lot of them are under tribal jurisdiction, and many of them are ending up incarcerated. So, and I say incarcerated, so in the Indian context, we use the term detention for everything. In the juvenile justice context, detention is pretrial, and incarceration is post-trial. There's no way to break those numbers down because it's all the same facility, so I'm just looking at who was locked up essentially here. So more than half of them are girls. The other thing is the number of standalone juvenile facilities has more than doubled. So there were 7 of them in 1988. There are, by my count, 18 of them in 2016. A couple of years ago, the last time I counted, there were 14, so it's still going up. This is good and bad news. So good news because we don't want to lock up juveniles in old, decrepit facilities, nor do we want to lock them up in adult facilities. So new standalone juvenile facilities are good in that way, but they're not good in the sense that we end up with an entire separate facility for every 5 to 10 kids across the country. And what that means in terms of money is enormous. So the money invested in juvenile anything across Indian country, so if you take compare the amount that goes to things like wellness courts and diversion programs, the tribal youth program, and compare that to what goes into the building of jails, the funding that comes from DOJ and BIA for building and running jails, it's nowhere close. So all the money is going to detention, and what happens in the communities in which there's a well-run detention center is that that's what there is. There's not a lot of energy and not a lot of money and not a lot of consistent funding for anything else, so that's where you put the kids. So most jurisdictions will say that they don't want to put kids in detention or incarceration facilities unless they absolutely need to. When I have visited a lot of these facilities, that's not the case. And I'm not suggesting that either the tribal leaders or the attorneys or the staff are making bad or evil decisions. What happens a lot is something like you have a kid and you have no one to release them to because their parents they can't be found or they're incapacitated for some reason. So you pick up a kid maybe because they were drunk or something, it's not a major offense, you can't send them home. And so because you can't send them home, they stay in the jail for a couple of days. So we are locking up, it's not for a long time, but we're locking up kids for things that it's generally considered to be not acceptable to lock kids up for, mostly because there's nothing else to do with them. I think we're going to hear today about programs that are alternatives. One of the things to also think about is that in some communities, you might actually need facilities that are alternatives. So I did a lot of this work up on the North Slope in Alaska, and if it's really cold and the kid has nowhere to go, you either need to have a person's house they can go to or like a runaway shelter or something, because you can't just release them out into the community where it's -50. So sometimes we actually need buildings, and buildings are hard to come by. The other thing is treatment. So when you need long-term drug and alcohol treatment, the only offense for which Native kids in the country are overrepresented at arrest is drug and alcohol related offenses. So they're sort of underrepresented at arrest for all other offenses compared to other kids. Overrepresented for those low-level drug and alcohol ones, but there's really not a lot of treatment options. So we've put all of the money into incarceration and not left much money for secure treatment or non-secure treatment or intervention programs. So there are promising models, but those models tend to be funded, unless the tribes have a lot of their own money, by these sort of piecemeal grants that come. So the tribal youth program is at 2 or 3 years. and you come up with a program and you do it for a couple of years and then you may lose your funding. And there's no way to figure out if your program is any good if you can only do it for a couple of years. By the time you train people and get staff, the program is over. And so there's a real need for ongoing programs with funding attached to them in the same way that we have attached to jails. Once you build a jail, you have ongoing funding for that jail. So this is just in terms of, so again, this is based on a rough count. In 2013, which is the last time I did this, based on the mid-year count of kids in detention for 2013, 38 of them, so less than a quarter, were in for a violent offense. The rest of them, property, drug and alcohol, and then other. And other is not violent because that violent category includes what they call other violent offenses. So this is 3/4 of the kids who are in detention are there for committing non-violent offenses. And so I suspect, and I think it's different for each tribe, but often what I wonder is, do all the tribal communities need incarceration at all, right? If mostly these are kids who have alcohol-related problems and they're ending up 3/4 of the detention facility is filled with those kids, could there just not be a detention facility and it could be directed toward other things? So I think that's an interesting question. I want to raise one more thing here. It's a lawyer thing. But I think that there is an argument, and I don't want to suggest that you go out and make it without doing some research first, because it's a newish one. But I've shown you a criminal jurisdiction chart, and I've talked about this as if it's criminal jurisdiction. But delinquency in the non-Indian context exists because we want to keep children out of the criminal system. So it is officially a non-criminal system. And federal courts have said in other contexts that when you do a criminal-like proceeding to a kid, you have to use criminal-like protections. So they're probably entitled to the same due process protections for the most part as adults. But what if you don't do a criminal-like proceeding? What if you're doing something else? It's possible that you could have an entire juvenile system that looks more like a child welfare system, and there's a strong argument, I think, that that is civil jurisdiction. Now, that may not matter if you're exercising both kinds of jurisdiction, but in places like Alaska, in which the exercise of criminal-like jurisdiction is really kind of susceptible to attack from the outside, having a civil system that didn't involve criminal penalties at all is a way in which tribes can potentially exert jurisdiction over their kids without having to address the questions of criminal jurisdiction. So I think it's important, and I'm going to guess that everyone here agrees, that strengthening tribes' control over this is important. So first thing is, tribes already have lots of control, in the sense that tribes have jurisdiction over almost all of these kids. But they don't have control over what the other governments do. And what happens sometimes is the other governments come in and undercut what the tribe is trying to do. So because it's NCAI, I like to throw out what I think are sort of some of the legislative areas of focus, should these come up. One thing is, I've done it by, here, this is the easy one. The Federal Juvenile Delinquency Act. So that is the law that establishes federal juvenile jurisdiction. To me, the very easiest fix that should have happened already is to change that law to say that federal prosecutors can't haul a kid into federal court for a juvenile offense until they check with the tribe, and the tribe waives jurisdiction. So when a tribe wants a kid to go to federal court because the resources are better or because they can't handle that kind of case, they can say yes. But when they want to handle it in tribal court, the federal court stays their hand. Now, that is exactly what they do with states. So that's already the law in states. The federal government doesn't come in and prosecute a kid in federal court unless they've checked with the state to see whether the state wants to exercise jurisdiction. That's one easy fix. The other big law is the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. This is where all the funding is authorized. More funding for tribes, more long-term funding for tribes can come from that. And any requirements, such as requirements that states involve tribes in trying to determine their juvenile justice policy, can be added to that act. One thing that we've seen here is that this would be a place in which the states do not ask whether kids are Indian country kids, or whether they will take a statistical sort of set of who's counts as an American Indian or a Native kid for their sort of racial breakdown, but they don't ask tribe, and they don't differentiate between who just says they're Native and who is actually potentially connected to a tribe. And so if they did that, if they just had a blank for asking the tribe, they would be able to go a long way toward notifying and working with tribes, and they're really resistant to doing that. They think it's technically difficult to do. So this is the bill under which I think it would be the place to force states to do that. And then the other possibility is using either the Indian Child Welfare Act or amending Public Law 280. Essentially, the goal would be to, in PL 280 states, you require states to defer to tribal prosecution just like the federal government would. And then in non-Indian country cases, you actually do something like the Indian Child Welfare Act, where you require states to notify and involve tribes. New Mexico has a law like that, and I think Oklahoma does. I think that there's some ways to go before those are implemented effectively, so those tend to be notification and talking laws, but then there's nothing about the exercise of jurisdiction and nothing that really guides anyone to figure out what you do after that. But the goal is to get tribes involved with every kid that they can have jurisdiction over. And it's been relatively successful in the child welfare context. It can be in the delinquency context. And then to have tribes garner the federal support for the outcomes that they want to see. So this is the last slide I'll show you. Let's say you want to fix the juvenile system in your community, or you don't have one and you're thinking of building one. If you kind of back up and start over, so instead of saying, what is this grant that's coming out and what's the easiest thing to apply for, because that's gonna, it's necessary, but it's gonna lead you to building a jail. And then you start over, you back up, you say, who's here? What offenses are they committing? What other issues are they facing? What resources do we already have here? And then you build a system around those things. So you use the stuff that you've already got. You think about, are people in danger from what the kids are doing? So that's a big deal, because you want to maybe use incarceration if people are in danger, but if they're not, you can do something different. What's the best way to provide services to these kids? How rural is it? What other services are around? Should we use an agreement? Is there something nearby that we can use an agreement for, or is there nothing? What do we need to build? Do we need incarceration at all, and if so, what role should it play? And then the laws have to be very clear. The very common experience in tribes and elsewhere is that if there's any ability to put a kid in a jail and the jail is there, they will be put there. So the laws have to be really stringent, that says only in these cases can they be incarcerated for any amount of time, and then they have to be enforced. And in the non-tribal context, sometimes this is done by people suing and watchdogging, and that's not happening. And I think that's sort of a good thing in tribal courts, but it means that that this community really has to be the watchdogs. And then find money and advice to support this vision. So this is what I try to do, which is try to get Congress and try to get the agencies to follow that vision, because most tribal leaders that I have talked to have a vision that doesn't rely on incarceration, and that they know their kids, they know what they need, but then it all gets turned around because the money doesn't track that at all. So for the lobbyists and for the policymakers, that's where the work is. For the people in the communities, the work is in trying to build a system that doesn't follow what the federal money says, but instead follows what the kids need. So what I hope is that the rest of the panel is people who are going to talk about how they've done this in their communities. All right, thank you.
I'm Johanna Farmer. Annette and I are going to talk about the Attendance Achievement Program at the Bosco Yaqui Tribe. We co-founded the Attendance Achievement Program in 2013. I worked at the prosecutor's office, and Annette worked in the education department. And while it wasn't a part of our job description to do this kind of work, we took that Sitting Bull quote, "Let us put our minds together to see what future we can build for our children," to heart, to really build a program that would address what was going on with our children and families at the tribe. The Attendance Achievement Program started out as a juvenile diversion program in the prosecutor's office and has evolved over time into an intervention program that is run to address truancy. The Attendance Achievement Program and the mission of both the prosecutor's office and the education department were to educate and empower our youth and families to improve their lives. Annette will speak to the formation and the structure of the Attendance Achievement Program, and then we'll discuss some of the successes and challenges that we had when we were building the program. But first, I'd like to speak about why we built a program around truancy. Why does truancy matter? So truancy is really an early warning sign for potential substance abuse, teen pregnancy, juvenile delinquency in other areas, and dropping out of school. It also can be an indicator of some larger things that are happening. Child abuse and neglect, for example, is one of the indicators that we can see when we're looking at truancy. Because dropping out can be easier than catching up for some of our kids, the potential impact is that they have a reduced earning capacity over their lifetime, but it also has an impact on health systems, it has an impact on the economy, and on prison systems. if you look at the micro level, the tribal economic cost can be that we have students that never graduated from high school, and so then we have to train uneducated tribal workers in order to fill the positions that we have. Otherwise, tribal governments are then required to hire non-tribal personnel to work in their departments. So when we look at Native American students in the Tucson Unified School District, where most of the Pasquayaki students went to, they had the lowest attendance rates of all of the students that were going to school. And then we looked at the criminal justice side of things, and we had looked at 100 people who had been in Pasquayaki tribal custody over a 6-month period, and the vast majority of them had never graduated from high school, and then the vast majority of those had never even finished the 8th or 9th grade. So it had this long-term impact also on the federal prison system, because some of those 100 people that were in tribal custody ended up in the federal prison with federal prison sentences. So education to us was this like critical building block, kind of a prevention and intervention method for us to catch kids early on so that we weren't having to deal with issues when they became adult criminals. So we were looking to engage the student, the family, and the schools through both behavioral, cognitive, and emotional engagement. We found out, what leads to truancy is discretionary factors, like the student doesn't think attendance is important, parents don't think attendance is important, or even like the school culture doesn't have a strong attendance as this is important that you attend school every day. Other factors were aversion factors, like the student wasn't doing well in school. They were struggling to go to school, get the grades that they were needed to make. And then the final one was barriers. We saw that there were things as simple as students didn't have school uniforms in order to attend school. So those were the things that we were looking at addressing when we started to develop the Attendance Achievement Program, and I'll let Annette talk about more of the formation and structure of the Attendance Achievement Program.
Thank you, Johanna. So in 2005, I started with the tribe in the education department, and as it stands today, the tribe still doesn't have any tribal schools, so all of our students still attend, the majority of Tucson Unified School District. The department, we did a lot of, as far as their strategies, and the employees would work on, parent monthly meetings with local feeder school leadership, and that's where we'd hear a lot of the things of what was going on with our kiddos there. Services that we were offering were transportation, a lot of suspension, expulsion hearings, and connections to services. So overall, in my perception, we were kind of coming across, we were being very reactive to systems that were taking place within the community, and there was a lot of historical trauma that was taking place in relation to education and how our families perceived education, and then how our schools perceived our tribal students in their schools. So it was working both ways. By 2008, I was the interim coordinator for the K-12 and higher education department, and I had initially wrote a parent program for families that were having issues with truancy. Unfortunately, we didn't have a whole lot of buy-in from leadership and from other departments, and it wasn't something that could have kind of lifted off the ground. But mid-year in 2012, the education director at the time created a solutions team meeting seeking to create a partnership with our schools to address some of the issues that we were hearing on a monthly basis that were like an ongoing cycle. And that's where we kind of brought in a lot of other departments, and we kind of came in together with that theme. It's, there's no silver bullet, and education, truancy is not education. It doesn't fall just in their lap. It takes all of us at the table. So that's kind of where I got introduced to Johanna in the prosecutor's office, because a lot of it, we all worked in silos. We all had to stay in our lane, and we had so much to do with our own capacities that it was really hard to jump over and to identify what was going on, not knowing that she had a really great running, mentoring program over there already. And so it was by the end of 2012 that Johanna and I kind of just shared passion for the community, for our youth, and kind of looking at the areas of what we wanted to do. And from there, we just kind of talked about the power of restorative versus reactive, and if we could as high as those flames looked, could we walk away from those things that we're used to doing every day and plan something for the long term and what was the best outcome for our kids? And to be able to look at, that strength-based approach, remove the lenses of all that historical trauma that's taken place with the schools or with departments and say, can we really come together and do this? Not basically what is the reality that we see that we can't really work together, we can't come together, and what are those walls that are already established, but not even look at it as that kind of approach. And to understand that we're going to reach our families the way that we would respect to in that cultural perspective, in meeting them where they're at and not kind of talking down to them, but to be able to become with them and then take that journey with them. And just understanding that change takes time, even with ourselves as adults and professionals. Change takes time, and to understand that we want to prepare our children for the rigor of the education system and to sustain our tribe. They are the biggest resource that we can invest in. We look at all these things that we want to invest in, and we know that our youth is that number one key. So that was the end of 2012. We decided to put a system together, and it was exactly that, just us two. We just said, let's come together, and let's not ask, let's just see what we can do and create a program before we kind of present it. So that's when the development started, and we went ahead and started doing some research, networking. Johanna was, outreaching to CTAS, CCI. There was an attendance achievement program. It's a school-based system that was working really well in Brooklyn, and we had made some contacts over there. They were willing to share some of that information, which was great, and we got a lot of foundational work from them. We also looked at, SMART goals. When we're going to get families here, can we put them on an evidence-based practice that we're going to help guarantee that they're going to see an outcome not with us, not with data, but within themselves, and to help them realize that we're going to do all this work to invest in their best outcome, that they can go ahead and take those practices with them after they have left the program. And then systems thinking. We're not going to try to write a grant and create all these programs and add all these new positions that we have to try to fund when that grant is over. But there's all of these departments that already function well enough, and they have those systems that how could we just access them seamlessly to be able to do that. But then, on the other side of it, we can have all those resources, but unless we have families and community members that know how to access all of those resources and then to use them for their function and not continue to use them, but to actually grow on them, was something that we also wanted to address. After we did that first phase, we met with our truancy officer at the time, and we mapped out all of the resources from school level, from tribal level, and then we have basically put the program together. We had met with a multidisciplinary team. So that's when we brought in, social services, our behavioral health, all of these different departments that have youth investments in. And we basically presented to them and let them know that we had not approached our leadership yet, but this was an endeavor that we wanted to come in as one. That this was an approach that we wanted to show that this is a commitment. And it's just kind of the same language that we do with our families. We all come together to help one another, and this is how we wanted to approach our leadership and approach our families. So after that commitment was made, we went ahead and presented to our department directors and our leadership, and it was approved to roll out the fall of 2013. So I can kind of go through briefly the system of AAP, which basically we had a whole lot of inconsistencies with getting information from the schools. So what we had to do is directly work with the police department. They were the first line. And I know that we're hearing a lot from Addie. She's like, what are you doing with the police? But we had to do what we had to do. There was walls that were being built. And when we're getting students that had over 80 to 112 days absent, we needed those sooner. So our police department jumped in and said, we're going to be that first line. That way we're not worried about releases of information. We're not worried about anything. They'll get the information. So this is 2013. This was the first system. It has evolved since then. But discretions were made with the officers. So at that time, a citation would be the first thing that families would get. So it would either be a citation or referral, and the officer would then again submit the referral, whether it be to education or sometimes to social services, because it was already at that level where we were finding some of these situations. So from there, we would go ahead and absorb them into the prosecutor's office, where they would have them sign an alternative to prosecution, and AAP would be embedded in that. So once they would come into AAP, we would kind of work in 3 steps, which is 3 phases of engagement, enrichment, and empowerment. And that's, again, going back to what we said in the beginning. What we wanted to do is provide them that power of choice, that power of, and giving them that power back to understand that the power of their choices, whether it's parents or children, and once they understand and realize that capacity, that it's something that they can never get taken away from them. And whether it's a seed that they, comes later in time, or with these children or their children, it's something that's going to be able to develop and evolve. So that's kind of like the entryway and how we would approach our families. We would start with an intake, and that's based on, just a general interview that we would handle with our families to help them and understand where they're at, what they perceive their challenges are, and then also their aspirations for their children. And if they really thought about it, what did they want for their children? What did they want for themselves and in regards to education? From there, we would create an achievement plan, and that achievement plan would be co-developed from both of our perspectives. We would go ahead and put into place all across the board some of the things that we would like to put in their lives, and then also the families identified what kinds of things that they wanted to strive for, because they have somebody in their corner for the next 6 to 9 months. What could I achieve? What kinds of things could I work towards? And then from there, all we did is we fractured that plan into 6 to 9 months and helped them by doing task lists, guidance, month by month until their program was over. And then we kind of let them look back and watch how attendance and achievement naturally took place when we kind of stopped focusing on, you need to be in school every day regardless of what's going on. And we just started filling their cup with their basic needs, and some things started happening. They started having that innate feeling of motivation again and feeling good about themselves. So since then, we had a site visit with Georgetown, and I know that we had kind of talked about, PYT, you're doing great work, but the worst thing we could be doing with data is getting kiddos in the court system. So I know that our chief prosecutor and I, we had a really deep discussion about this could change the face of how we are working with AAP. And then due to recent, situations that had taken place within our community and with staffing, we just decided to jump on board with it. So this past October in 2017, we now receive the files before the police department still get the files. However, they give them to the AAP program, and now we get to divert the whole citation process. And then we have like a 30-day deposition to see if we can hang on to them and make that firm commitment with the family before they would go on to any type of court involvement at all.
So Annette touched on some of the things that made us successful. One of the biggest things, I think, was that we were a multidisciplinary team. The thing is you have experts all across your tribal departments, and so coming from the prosecutors and legal perspective, I'm like, I am not an expert in education by any means. I don't know what an IEP is, what the process is that you have to go through to get an IEP, but you know what? We have partners over in education that totally have that ability to do that. And then on the other side, the education department didn't have any view of how the legal system was working and if they were working with families to help guide them through that process. So we had the prosecutor's office involved, we had the education department, we had our behavioral health system involved, and then our court really bought into the process as well. So they were on board with the attendance achievement program, and our probation officers were also a vital piece in helping us be successful as a program. I think the other thing that made us really successful is that we knew the language of the families. We knew what they were speaking. We also knew the language of the departments. So it was easy for us to connect the families to the departments Because when we were doing intakes, we were finding the vast majority of the families were not taking any services that were available to them into their lives, in part because they were like, we felt like there were people that needed these services more than we needed these services. And yet here you had these families that were really struggling with a lot of issues. The other thing I think that made us really successful was that we did make that connection to the families. When we sat down and did an intake with a family, we really put our hearts out there for them and said, you know what, in the culture, when you have something bad happen, what happens? All of your family comes together and you figure out a way to make everything happen. And that's what we're doing with this program, is we're coming together as a family to support you while you're going through this time that might be very trying or hard for you. And then I think the code is one of the things that also made it successful. So we had a juvenile, we have a truancy code that's in place at Bosco Yaqui, and it's available on our internet if you'd like to take a look at it. One of the pieces of that code that's really successful is it allows our school resource officer to share information with any person that they believe will help provide services to this child. So this is how one of the key pieces in us getting the attendance achievement program to be really successful is that ability to share information that, unfortunately for us, like Annette had talked about, we don't have any tribal schools, so we rely on an outside entity to be providing education to our students, and they were really not about sharing information with us, even when it came to really difficult situations. And then I think we also had data. So that first year we were collecting a lot of data to prove that the attendance achievement program was a program that shouldn't just be a pilot program, but a long-term program that was in place. And one of the things that we found in that first year was that the kids that were using the attendance achievement program attended 14 more days of school. So that is huge. Even when we talk about, 10 days makes a huge difference in the education piece of things. But I think our challenges were definitely what Annette talked about, like the leadership piece early on before we had even thought about the attendance achievement program. The silos that existed, and then the limitation sometimes people think about their roles in their jobs. Anything you'd like to add about the successes and challenges?
No, I could probably leave it for.
So the last thing that I'd just like to say is that, be a champion for a child. Annette and I worked really hard to advocate for our children and families to have this program, to provide them with the resources and services that they needed for things that were even as simple, like I said, as like school uniforms, alarm clocks, the simple stuff that we sometimes take for granted or people take for granted, but then as big as things as, we were encountering kids who had experienced sexual assault, and that's one of the reasons that they weren't attending school. And so we could connect them to those counseling resources even though we weren't counselors, but we had the ability to connect them to that resource. So one person I think really can make a difference in the life of a child. And I know that, some of this sounds like all roses, but, the thing is that Annette and I were committed to doing the work. And we knew, and we had told council, we might not always be successful at this, but we're going to keep trying, and we're going to learn from our failures. And we know that there are kids that are not going to be successful, that aren't going to have perfect attendance. But how do we keep supporting those family and those children through what they're going through in their lives?
Hello, my name is David MacArthur, and I work with the Juvenile Healing and Wellness Court program in White Earth, Minnesota, for the White Earth Nation. I guess we were asked here to come here last week to talk a little bit about our Wellness Court program and the things that we do. Our Wellness Court program started about 2010, and the way it was brought to my attention, it was brought in, laid on my desk, and they said, figure this out. So I took the grant and we started to run with it. One thing that's unique about White Earth is that we're a public law 280 state, so everything that we do with criminal jurisdiction goes through the counties. So at that point in time, we set out and started to set up meetings with the counties and the county judges, county attorneys, county probation, did about a 10-15 minute presentation with each one of those, explaining to them what we were going to do in our program. So luckily we got to buy-in. We started getting referrals within the first 3 months of the existence of the program, and then we've been like adapting and changing things as time has moved on. We started out, the program was a 6 to 9 month program, and it was more like the westernized way of doing things. The kids would come in, if they messed up, we ended up putting them, like she was saying, we ended up locking them up, or we ended up doing something under probation violations. And we really emphasized that in our program. As we worked the kids and we seen that that wasn't working, we developed a way that we brought incentives and sanctions into the program. So if the kids did well, they received a nice incentive during court, which was an iPad or an iPod or something like that if they were doing well. And if they weren't, then we did sanctions of, like, you know, sending them out to stack wood, helping elders shovel their driveways, stuff like that. That seemed to really start to help with the kids' attitudes. It really started changing the way that they were seeing things. They didn't see it as a punitive thing. As we went along, we started to develop other relationships with our chemical dependency programs, our mental health programs, law enforcement, and everything like that. So we invited all these people in, and they all became active members of our board. So when we have our staffings, when we talk about the kids, everybody's there. We have state law enforcement officers, Becker County Sheriff's Office, Monolman County Sheriff's Office, White Earth Police Department, probation, county attorneys, the other prosecutors, defense attorneys, all at one table trying to decide what's right for this kid. So as time went on, we started to see that the kids were lacking culture in their home life, in everything that they were doing, and everything. It was a big void, and it was something that they were reaching for, but it wasn't there, nobody there to provide it for them. So we developed within our program to bring culture to the kids. I think in 2012, we started with our first sweat lodge. We brought our kids into the program, and we had our sweat lodge set up, introduced them to that sweat lodge, and boy, you should have seen there was a lot of kids scared of that sweat lodge. They were scared of the bad stories that they've heard from other people about that lodge. But as we explained it to them and let them know that this is a healing place, you know, we ended up getting a few to come in, and the next thing you know, we had 15, 20 kids at one time going into that lodge. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm kind of nervous about talking in front of people, so if I do jump around and stuff, you know, don't hold that against me. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the program really took off when we brought our culture back to the kids. When we brought culture back and started showing the kids that there was ways that culture heals your trauma. A lot of our kids that have come into our programs, there's a lot of kids that have been sexually abused, physically abused. They don't have a family. They don't have a mother. They don't have a father at home that's taking care of them. They're literally living on their own. They're either living, if they're taken away by ICW, that's causing trauma on them. They're living with their grandma and grandpas who are spending time at the casino, and they're putting our kids up in the hotel and expecting them to behave and live there. And that's causing some trauma on our kids. So there was never any structure, anything in their lives. So one thing that we did with the culture is give them somewhere to go to heal and to be able to talk about those things and let them know that we're there for them. So the culture was the main thing that's made our program successful. Our program started out as a 6 to 9 month program, but we had kids that would actually go through 6 to 9 months, and on their last phase, their fourth phase of the program, they'd find a way to sabotage themselves so they could stay into that program. So we could take and, you know, work with them longer. We've had kids up to 2 years in our program that we've been trying to get out the door, but they want to stay there. They want to keep coming back to the building. So all this started happening. We were a traditional court. We were under the regular court systems and stuff like that. So then we started looking at how we could self-fund ourselves, how we could make money and be able to self-sustain what we had going on. So at that point, we decided to move our program underneath behavioral health. So when we moved our program underneath our behavioral health program, we were able to bill for our services that we were offering our kids. So when our case managers were going out, case managing the kids, they were doing the same work as an ICW worker, but it was more intense. It was like more intensive, like, you know, if you have to see intensive probation when someone's got to leave their house, they needed to check in with us. Our first phase of our program, you're on house arrest. You come in there, you go on a GPS unit actually, and we monitor and make sure that you're doing what we have set up for you, because these kids never had structure. So if you expected someone to go home and stay home, they weren't going to stay home. There was nobody there to keep them home. So then we put the bracelets on them, got them to do that, got them to start staying home, doing what they needed to do. I lost the train of thought. Your phases. Oh, so in that phase, that was a really restrictive phase. So then you go to phase 2 and it lets off. What? I guess I kind of lost it. I'm still lost here. But, you know, when the kids found that structure and they found out that they needed to listen and they needed to move on, they started being successful. We started getting the culture introduced to them and started showing them what they needed to do, and they started doing really well. Once we started working with all these other departments, and like I said, I'm kind of jumping around and I apologize for that, but once we started working with other departments with mental health and chemical dependency, we started seeing how all these walls were built. Like you guys are saying, all the silos. No one was talking back and forth to each other. So our kids were all running like 3, 4, 5 different case plans. That was added stress. Their school was added stress. Probation chasing was added stress. So we worked really hard at breaking down those barriers, and we moved everybody underneath one roof. So now when they're referred into our program, they're referred in. The minute that they come into our program, they need to do a mental health diagnostic assessment, and then they also need to do a Rule 25 assessment. And then they need to follow all those recommendations. Well, at that point, our case managers jump in, make sure that they're doing what they needed to do. We're able to bill for those services. We're able to bill assisting Indian child welfare with what they are doing. And then we bring the kids through the program. One thing that we did see was when we were making referrals to mental health, and I'll just use one case. We had one gal that got referred to mental health. She called the crisis line, and she said that she's having dreams. And she said that I'm hearing voices, or I see things. So we got called to go assist with the mental health team, and right away they were going to put her into a 72-hour hold because they figured that she was losing her mind. It ain't right for you to hear things or dream these things or see things moving around in the room. But after we sat and talked to her and visited with her for a little bit, we realized it was more of a cultural thing. It was more of a spiritual thing that she was working with. So we were able to divert her out of going to a 72-hour hold, and we brought her back over here and we did ceremony for her, and we got her going through the sweat lodge. So now when we make those referrals to our mental health team, when that referral gets to the mental health team, they need to do a cultural consultation, is what we call it. So they need to meet with a spiritual elder, and then they decide. Those two people will decide whether it's a cultural or a spiritual thing, or if it's a mental health issue. So right there, that's going to help a lot of our kids, because a lot of our kids they're spiritual, but they just don't realize it. They just don't realize how in tune they are with what's going on around them. So we developed that program to kind of divert the kids away from going into mental health. The program that we developed has been it's been just awesome working with the counties and with the state. I know everybody says that it's really hard to get those relationships going, but if you put your time and effort into showing them that you're actually going to hold the kids accountable and move them on and help them to a better life, these guys usually jump right on. We take kids that have been charged with first-degree assaults, second-degree assaults, which are high felonies, arson. We've taken on kids that people look at you and they say they're never going to be successful. Their whole family, everything, you know, they're just going to be in jail. Why are you even messing with them? And some of those kids will come through, and not all of them will successfully graduate. Not all of them will come through and make that 6 to 9 month program and graduate. But they learn something, and they've learned something to keep them out of trouble. Everybody that comes through, when they leave, whether it's successful or non-successful, we monitor them for 6 months. We keep their case open, we follow their case, we make sure that they're following through with the services that we had provided with them. Majority of our kids, I think we probably had in the last 5 years, we probably had 6 kids reoffend out of probably about, what, 70? 70 come through the program. Chemical use side's a little bit different, you know. They all like their weed, so it's hard to get them away from smoking that weed, you know. But when at least when they're doing it, they know that there's a point where you got to stop. You know, getting into that criminal activity and stuff like that is not a good thing. So, I guess, you know, I know there's a lot to talk about what we do, and I have a hard time, especially when I didn't receive direction on what I was supposed to talk about today. But you know, the program, I can't get over how well this wellness court program works. I mean, I've been in law enforcement for 15 years, and you've been what 17 now? 22. Well, 22 years, and both of us were hardcore like cops. I mean, if I seen you walking down the road, you're a criminal. You know what I mean? I was going to find some way to put you in jail. And this program, with how it's brought understanding, I think, to all of our local law enforcement, to where that they understand that there's more to things. There's more trauma. There's more things out there. I think it's kind of opened up their minds a little bit. So when they're dealing with that kid, they're a little bit, you know, more receptive. The other thing that we did do is develop a trauma-informed court. We developed all of our own. We got a grant this year or last year for a trauma-informed court, so we started a trauma-informed court. We developed all of our policies and procedures for it. We developed our own intake process. We developed our own screenings and everything's culturally based. When the kids come in, if you ever see a mental health person talk to someone one of their clients, it seems like they're always talking down to them, especially kids. You know, when I'm sitting at a table and you have a mental health person sitting over here and they look at you and they go, how does this make you feel? If you tell them something, first thing I tell them is like, what's it to you? You know, if they approach me in a cultural way or in a personable way and say, well, you know, I've had that stuff happen to me before, and you know, this is the way that I did this, then you start to kind of respond and talk to them. So that's one thing that we've been trying to do with our mental health team is to bring them back to the culture and bring them back to using culture to reach out to the kids. So right now we developed a trauma-informed court, and that'll be based on all the seasonal teachings. So when the kid comes through, he'll be taught the seasonal teachings by our elders. Once they learn those teachings and once they figure out what's going on there, when they complete that program, then they're going to come back and they're going to teach the new kids that are coming through. So there's a lot of different things that we're doing, and it's hard for me to sit and talk about it because I'm the type of person that just wants to do it. I don't want to talk about it, you know, and when I talk to Anna and different people and they tell us that we're doing such a good job and the stuff that we're doing is you know, out there, to me it's just like we're just doing it. You know, I don't want to talk about it, I just want to do it, you know. So I have a hard time doing that, so if I'm kind of jumping all over, I'm sorry, I apologize.
Hey Dave, is everyone that comes to the program, is it court recommended, or can they just come on their own without having no kind of problems, or?
Yeah, it started out, he had to go through the court system, he had to be referred in from the state courts to be able to get into the program. But then we saw that we were starting to have, we saw that we needed to intervene before the kids made it that far. So we started reaching out to the schools and we implemented our court programs into the schools. So if a kid goes and gets in trouble in school, we start diversion right in school. So if they're looking at expulsion or if they're looking at suspension or anything like that, the school will send us a letter. We'll do the Rule 25 assessment, diagnostic assessments, make sure that they're going through what they need to go through. And if they successfully complete, then everything gets wiped off their permanent record in the school. We started that program with our DIA school, and now we've reached out to all the county school or the state schools that are around. So we have that on our, I think, Bob and Benoman. There's like 7, 8 schools that we reach out to now and do that.
You just don't have any coming in for like peer support or anything like that?
Very rare that we do. We have a few that the parents will make referrals in. And one thing that we do with the parents, if they do make a voluntary, want to open up a voluntary case, is we ask them to do that with ICW too. So that when we're working with that kid, and let's say he's not listening to mom and he's running away and he's doing all that, ICW can step in and do a placement, like a weekend placement, just to wake them up a little bit and say, hey, this is what's going to happen if you don't do what you need to do. So we do accept them on that, but we always encourage them to do that voluntary placement or voluntary case with ICW.
Oh, I was kind of wondering, like, how long does this mental assessment stay on a record for these young people like this? I mean, if it's they're a one-time issue thing, you know, is that a mental issue, or you know, through mental health to have this kind of assessment done on them, or how long does that stay with them?
Well, the assessment, once they do the diagnostic assessment, that diagnostic is good for 6 months. So they can work off that plan for them for 6 months, and then if it needs to be updated, they can update it and go for a year. But how can I put that? The diagnostic assessment is covered by HIPAA so much that like law enforcement and everything would never have access to that unless they come through our program. So when they come through that program, and if they're kids that come through that aren't ordered in by the state court, then these guys don't know what's going on with their mental health. That's all kept between them.
And so with your program, if it gets diverted through the state court, is that a way for them to kind of get it like acquitted or
Yes.
for the charges? And if they don't successfully complete the program, do they go back in through the state court or?
Yes, when they get diverted into our court, if they successfully complete, those charges are gone. So we're looking at kids that are coming in with pretty high felonies sometimes. And if they come in and they successfully complete, it's gone. If they don't successfully complete, then they get referred back to their probation agent, and then they'll have to follow through with their probation or extended probation, or
At the state level?
Yeah, and they'll have to do their time. So yeah, it's a pretty good little diverse. I don't know if Ty wants to talk a little bit about what you've seen with the court.
I started with the court probably approximately 3 years ago. Dave and I have known each other since longer than either one of us care to mention. We were young kids. I grew up in White Earth, started copping up there about 22 years ago. One thing that hit me here was about 3 years ago, there's one of our villages, there's a family, rather large family, and they have grandfather, father, and son. They're the first, second, third generation. And I was telling Dave one day that it was a couple weeks prior to me talking to him, is that I have now arrested all 3 generations. And I said, this is sad. Something's got to change. Something's got to give here. And he started speaking to me about the Juvenile Wellness and Healing Program, and I thought, this is something, I want to be more proactive and not reactive. We're not getting anywhere. We're chasing our tails in a circle here by being reactive, so let's get ahead of it. So what I started doing, going to the Juvenile Wellness Board and sitting on the court, these kids start to get to know me rather than just the badge. They get to see me on a different level. I have participated with sweats, stuff like that, just to visit with them and sit down and talk with them, so they're not that fear when you show up, like, oh, what's going to happen to me now? And I think it's helping. It's not only the person that you deal with, the child that you deal with, but then he'll go back and tell some of his friends, hey, that cop, he's not so bad. I talked to him before, you know, he treated me fairly. Yeah, it's been a real awesome to see the success that is going on with this program. These kids are, there's hope for the future, and that's good to see.
It's, one thing, I guess I give a couple examples. We had one individual that come through the program that I was telling Umsy about that earlier today, but he was coming through the program and he had some mental health issues. He ended up having a brain injury when he was about sixth grade, sixth grade, and he was supposed to go back and do follow-up appointments, and his parents never took him to any of those appointments. So he ended up having a tumor or whatever moved off his brain, and from that he had some damage and he had some issues. So one day he was in the program and he comes through the program and we were working with him, and we just happened to be up at the school having one of our meetings. And this young man got caught smoking, which is, you know, it's no big deal. You know, he got caught smoking and they brought him up and we started visiting with him. And his criminal history is probably as long as this room at 16, 17 years old, from car thefts to gun possession, suspected in drive-by shootings. He's had all this stuff that was going on in his life. So he's sitting there, he comes in and we kind of joked around, like I was telling Hums and those guys earlier today, we were joking around, kind of raising a little cane with him, you know. And he is laughing, and pretty soon he stood up and he went over to the corner and he flipped his hood up on his sweatshirt, and he sat like this and started staring at the ground. So not knowing, you know, if it would have been any other program, we probably went to know what was going on. Well, everybody left. We walked up to him and I started talking with him, and I asked him what was going on, and he says, he goes, I want to kill someone. He goes, I see things on the walls, and I see this, and I see that, and I hear these voices telling me things, and he goes, I'm going to kill someone. And I said, well, who are you going to kill? He goes, well, I'm going to kill my teacher. And then he goes, I'm going to kill so-and-so because he's been on my ass. Oops, sorry. But anyway, that's what he was saying. I speak, I'm sorry. But he says it because he's been on my rear, and he goes, I'm going to kill him. So I said, all right, we visited for a while, and I said, well, where do you got this gun? How are you going to walk into the gun? Well, I got a shotgun. I said, well, how are you going to bring a shotgun into school? And he goes, well, it's about this big. Anyway, we visited for a while, and he drew me a map of how to go get where this gun was. So the first thing I did, and this is kind of before we had a really good relationship with law enforcement, the first thing I did being an ex-cop is go to law enforcement and say, hey, let's go get this gun. Well, who did this? Told them who the kid was. Oh, man. They wanted to get him right away. He's supposed to have done this, he's supposed to have done this, he's supposed to have done a burglary, he's supposed to... I said, don't matter right now. He's doing one thing in his life right now. He's doing one thing that's right. And we can't punish him for doing one thing right now. We can't punish him for doing the right thing. Nope, we're going to arrest him. I said, then took that piece of paper back, rolled it back up, put it in my pocket, and I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, what gun? No, I like that. Well, anyway, we argued back and forth, and I won the war. And law enforcement went out with me, and sure enough, we pulled out the shotgun. We went out in the woods, and, I wish I could draw you a thing, but we walked way out in the middle of the woods. And we pulled out this shotgun that he had wrapped up in cloth and plastic bags. Sure enough, shotgun was that long. If I would have took that shotgun and walked into this building today, I could have put it in the kangaroo pocket of a sweatshirt, and nobody would have knew. He told me, and I was talking to him, that he had one bird shot, one slug. And he said the slug was for the teacher. He was going to shoot the teacher in the head with that, and the bird shot he was going to shoot the kid in the face with. And sure enough, there it was. So I guess the point of that story is that collaborating and working with everyone within your departments, mental health, whether it be mental health, ICW, substance abuse, law enforcement, and all that, and bringing them in the culture and everything that we do, there's a lot of gain to that, a lot of trust that we built with one young man, where that young man gave us something that he was ready to commit that murder. He was ready to do it. This young man ended up leaving, he ended up going to placement, he ended up doing some things like that. Well, then he got out here not long ago, and at this point, he's like 19, 20 years old. And he calls again, having the same issues. But this time we were able to step up, get our cultural people involved, get our mental health people who understood his way of thinking and everything, and they worked with him, and now he's out in North Dakota, and he's successful, he's got a job, he's doing what he needs to do. But I can't emphasize how important bringing our kids back to our language, our culture, and the things that we have at the res that make them unique. They're lost. They're absolutely lost without that. They're walking around and they don't know where they belong because that big part of them is missing. So once you bring that culture and you bring everything back to those kids and you ground them again, and they know that there's people out there who care, and know there's people out there who have gone through the same things that they have, who have lost their culture but are at 45 years old. I'm working my way back through it. I was never raised with culture, but I always knew there was a little part of me missing, and that's the way that these kids are. And we're slowly on White Earth, we're slowly bringing those kids back to that, and it's really being successful with their behaviors. So I really don't have anything else I can really say other. I can stutter around a little bit more and jump all over and and be nervous with the way I talk. But yeah, if you got an opportunity to do a wellness court, you have an opportunity to work with your state, start those relationships. At first, yeah, you're a little bit bantering back and forth about who's more powerful or who can do this or who can do that. But when it comes down to the end, they're all working for the same goal. We're all working to better our communities, better our children, and better everybody's lives. So,
At this point right now, I brought it to the sheriff and the chief deputy, and since I attend these meetings, they're talking about having the officers do basically like a diagnostics in the field of where should this child go? Should we take him to jail, or should we get him deferred into this court? And that's huge, to be able to have that cooperation between the tribal and the state.
Yeah, we're looking at trying to get that recommendation coming right from the deputies or right from the officers now, right citation. And then that'll go right to our county attorneys, and then they'll make that referral back. One other thing I'd like to touch on before I stop talking is that I do manage a substance abuse program for adolescents too. And same thing, we brought culture, we bring everything back, we're working with our kids with culture and everything in our programming. One idea that I don't know if it's ever gonna happen, but one idea that I always look at is that we take these kids that are having issues with their mental health and substance abuse, we send them off and we get things going right? We got them set. All right, we get good reports. All these places are saying, man, these kids are unbelievable. I thought you said they were, mean and whatever. And these are awesome kids. But then those kids, once they graduate, we're bringing them back, and where do we put them? We put them right back in with an unhealthy family, right? So we got mom that's maybe using, dad's in prison. They have no structure at home, and we're bringing these kids back, and we stick them right back there. And then we're looking at them, and we're saying, now you be successful. Well, how long that's going to last. I was a kid. If I didn't have nobody watching over me, I'd be out running around in the streets too, What I'd really be awesome to be able to see is a place to slowly transition our kids back, to bring them back, slowly transition them into the community, and then also a 72-hour holding facility to where if these kids are picked up by law enforcement, they're able to be brought into this program or into this facility, held for 72 hours, start that process of the Rule 25 and substance abuse and get them going. And then the other thing is to heal the families together. Instead of having separate treatment, bring that treatment together and have your family go through with the adolescent and heal everybody together. Those are the three things. If we can implement those three things, we're going to change a lot. So thank you, and again, I apologize for not being the greatest speaker.
Hello. Can you guys hear me? My name is Anna Rangel Clough, and I'm here today on behalf of the OJJDP Tribal Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center. And we are located in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And I just want to thank you all for inviting me here to speak and share a little bit about what we do and the services that we provide to OJJDP tribal grantees and then other federally recognized tribes. So I'm not here on behalf of OJJDP, I'm here on behalf of the TA Center, but I wanted you guys to see the mission and vision of OJJDP, and that's obviously where our children are free from crime and violence. They have a mission to support states, tribal communities, and others with reduction in juvenile delinquency, prevention, and establishing systems that support public safety. So you can view more about OJJDP on their website if you want to learn more about the mission and vision and the current objectives of the Department of Justice. So at the OJJDP Tribal Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center, we provide training and technical assistance support to funded sites. So if you have a current funded award for CTAS Purpose Area 8 or CTAS Purpose Area 9, we provide training and assistance for managing your grant and working through all the processes that are required when you do get federal funding to support a project. We're also able to serve any federally recognized tribe and really any request that comes through that is related to tribal questions and justice processes. We can answer those. So we get a lot of questions from states, from counties, and then any tribe can contact us at any time for training or technical support for anything that they're working on. So as I said, we're directed by Dr. Dolores Subia Bigfoot, and we work within the Indian Country Child Trauma Center, and that's actually housed in the Center for Child Abuse and Neglect at the Health Science Center, which is a lot of letters, so it takes about a page to write where we're at. But we have been there for the last 3 years, and Dr. Bigfoot has had Project Making Medicine for about a decade and a half before that. So she's been with the Health Science Center for a couple of decades now. So as you can see, CTAS Purpose Area 8 is Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Courts. That's a funding stream that's available through the CTAS awards. And then Purpose Area 9 are tribal youth programs. And tribal youth programs are really any intervention or prevention program, and they can also be court-based programs. And so these are things like after-school programs, mentorship programs, really anything that has to do with prevention or intervention. And the great thing about it is that really if your community has something that they envision to work with your youth, there is a pretty broad spectrum of how to work that into a tribal youth program scope. And then with juvenile healing to wellness, like Dave was saying, there are many approaches to developing a juvenile healing to wellness court, and those are both court-based and then also system-based approaches. And so if you're interested in developing a juvenile healing to wellness court, we have resources to support you in that. So currently, and I'm speaking specifically to Healing to Wellness, but if you have questions about tribal youth programs, I'm happy to answer those. But today we're focusing on Healing to Wellness. These are currently the states where there is an OJJDP funded site, but this doesn't include communities that have a Healing to Wellness court program that's not funded. And so there are communities across the country that are starting or have had a Healing to Wellness court in the past or ongoing. And so I just included the OJJDP funded ones here. But as you can see, there's quite a few, and we're seeing many communities interested in this process and developing it. And I'm here today to answer questions if you're interested in that. So how many communities here currently have a Healing to Wellness court? Is there anyone in here that has one besides the presenters? Are any of you interested in developing a Healing to Wellness court or learning more about it? Please raise your hand, or I should probably stop talking. Okay, so Healing to Wellness courts themselves. The adult Healing to Wellness court is derived from the drug court system, and so the drug court system came about in the early 80s, and from there, a Healing to Wellness court adult adaptation started a couple of decades ago. And so the juvenile healing to wellness court movement is based on key concepts that we've seen working within the adult wellness court. But the core of a healing to wellness court, one is teamwork, collaboration, and that's to support the youth that you're serving. They're based upon your community's individual values and the needs of the specific youth within your community. And so we know that there's key elements that support adult courts, but really when it comes down to it, the wellness court that you develop within your community should be based, one, on your community's values, two, on the capacity that you have in your community, and then three, the willingness of the people that are going to develop it. So like Dave is saying, intervention is not pretty. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of commitment, and so if you're really going to start a Healing to Wellness Court project, you need to have the full support of your community's leadership, and then also, I think, directly speaking to success is the willingness of the people that are going to develop it, and so it really takes commitment, and it takes a willingness to get into those difficult situations that, trouble our youth as they need intervention, they need help. So it's based on an intensive process within the judicial system, including very intensive services by the court, and then collaboration with mental health service providers as they're available, and then cultural leadership within the community. And that could be an elder, that could be a spiritual guide, that could really be anyone who's willing to come in and support youth in cultural intervention within the court. So I have a few suggested practices and then some resources at the end. And I really feel like the communities that are here are the ones that have the most knowledge about, what really works in prevention and intervention. And so I want to leave time for questions at the end for that. So one is, if you're going to develop a Healing to Wellness Court, is encouraging community coordination before you start the work. So that's an awareness of what's actually happening within the community, and that's trends with, what kind of drugs are youth actually using, what are we seeing an increase in, and I think that's where it comes into what are they being arrested for. So collaboration with law enforcement and then with judicial staff that are currently in place. Secondarily would be knowledge of the wellness court approach. So if you don't know how a wellness court operates, or if you have staff coming on board that don't understand the wellness court process, I think that's a barrier to what does this really look like. And I think what I would encourage is, one, yes, there are key components and there are approaches that we see that are working, and so you want to follow those, but at the same time, look to developing your court based on what works in the community, and integrating cross-training between your multidisciplinary partners. And then third is support and engagement with the community. And so one is an awareness of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then connecting with the partners in your community that can actually support that. And that means follow through with developing a memorandum of understanding. That means consent forms, all the really hard administrative things that come along with developing an entire system. So one thing that we like to encourage at our TA Center, but it's a priority of the Tribal Youth TTA Center previous to our housing it, is one is being youth-focused in development. And so that's actually encouraging youth feedback in the processes that you're developing. And there are actually a few wellness courts that do have tribal youth councils that contribute that feedback to what processes really work, what are they interested in, what kind of incentives and sanctions would actually be effective, integrating that feedback. Two would be if you have an established program and you have graduates, taking that feedback and integrating into your case processes. And so White Earth is actually one of our tribal grantees that we've worked with pretty closely, and Dave has taught me a lot about what's been helpful and what has not been helpful in their community. And I think having graduates give feedback and talk about how they can come back in and help mentor youth that are going through and just starting the program has been an effective use of feedback from graduates. Second, I'd like to say trauma-informed services, and so trauma-informed approaches are one of the things that we really encourage if you're developing a wellness court generally, but specific focus because we know that American Indian youth suffer from numerous historical trauma, present trauma, and all the things that we talked about today already. Identifying your staff and partners that will support your community values and understand the mission and vision of the Wellness Court. And so when we say staff and partners, if you are in a community where you know you're going to rely on non-tribal partners for referrals, do they understand your community's values, your traditions, and do they respect those? And are you getting behavioral health service providers and other judicial support providers that care about what your community's values are and want to support you as you engage youth culturally? And so I think that's vital to success, especially when you're working with partners that are not tribal partners. And then even internally, like, you know, when we struggle with different programs, having different just roles and responsibilities and things that they have to do. If you have a law enforcement officer who, you know, he's on duty this many days a week and he doesn't have time to really support the wellness court, you're going to have to look at staffing and capacity when you start to develop the wellness court, and who's actually going to be on the ground providing services, what are individual roles and responsibilities going to be, and then ensuring that you have the staff and the capacity to support youth, because definitely what you don't want to happen is to start a program and then not really be there to actually provide services for youth, and then to leave them in the same position that they're in a general judicial system, which is that touch base, move on, you know, we'll see you in a couple months and see how you're doing. That's not the approach in the wellness court. It is much more involved, much more in depth, and it takes an extreme amount of commitment to make it work successfully. Fourth is integrating cultural teaching within the wellness court. And so one of the guiding, I think, principles within the wellness court structure is the respect for community's tradition and values, and to support youth as they either one, re-engage, to begin to understand if that cultural component, if that's not something that was in their life presently, as they take part in the wellness court structure, being able to take part in it and learn. You know, I like what Merlin says about becoming a member of the community as they start to engage within the wellness court. And so really respecting and honoring youth as they overcome these struggles that they're experiencing in life. Struggles that, one, probably aren't their fault because of all of the environmental factors that they're facing, but really acting with integrity as you try to engage them. And I wanted to add that the wellness court isn't a free pass, so it's not saying you don't have to go to jail, you don't have to do anything. It's really about accountability, and it's really structured accountability for, one, the community, because you're investing your time and your energy and your commitment toward that youth, and then the youth as they engage within the wellness court, because yes, it is a diversion program from not going to jail, but at the same time, it's the ability to, you know, become healthy and live a good life in the community. So some of the resources that we have available at the TA Center, we do have like an introductory Healing to Wellness handbook, and that provides some initial planning structure for communities that are, one, interested or just starting a Healing to Wellness court. And this handbook actually melds some of the juvenile drug treatment court principles along with adult wellness court principles that are in existence. And so we really tried to share both Western and tribal-based approaches to supporting youth who are trying to overcome their addiction to drugs and alcohol. And then TLPI has an abundance of resources supportive of both adults and juveniles. And then Tribal Access to Justice Innovation, there's some information there about developed wellness courts. And if you would like a copy of these slides, I can get those to you if you want to come up afterward. And then really quickly, the TA Center has some free training for any federally recognized tribe, and I have flyers up here, so I won't talk too long about them. But specifically, trauma-informed policing, that's for any tribal law enforcement officer. It's free. It's only about half an hour. We do have one state that's CLEAT accredited, but you can learn more about that up here, and I can answer questions about that. And then we have suicide prevention modules, one for teacher, and then the friend-to-friend module. And these are actually for youth, and they're focused on suicide prevention efforts. So I hope I didn't go way too fast, but I'm really appreciative of everyone that shared today. And you know, I was trying to come up with some really great analogy or story, but I did think of one thing, and that was when I was really little, I liked to go to the zoo because they had this black box, and you pushed each light, and it would like shine one thing that was in the box. You couldn't see everything because it was just a box screen, but if you pushed the light, you could see, like, in this corner there was this really pretty gem, and in this corner there's like a bat hanging upside down, and in this corner, there's some different rock structures. And so some of that stuff is really pretty, and some of it wasn't. It was kind of scary as a little kid. And I think what the Healing to Wellness Court does is it comes in, it like flips that light on, so you see everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you're really there to support youth as they try to better themselves and overcome all of these impacts on their life. And I really think for us to stand idly by and not do anything is wrong, and that we should all invest the commitment into our youth. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone on the panel. And that being said, does anybody in the audience have any questions regarding the panelists' presentations, any of the programs that have been presented here? No? I do have a couple follow-up thoughts as well, and some additional questions, and some additional resources as well. So at NIJA, we also are TA providers to some of the CTAS purpose area grantees as well. So a lot of the issues that were covered and that were talked about and supported through OJJDP, we have some overlapping support through the Purpose Area 3 program, which is the General Substance Abuse Grant. So for those of you that have CTAS Purpose Area 3 grants, we can provide the TA for that as well. And so oftentimes where we're seeing the overlap is where there are healing to wellness programs, where they're having collateral issues or programs coming out of the implementation of their healing to wellness program, like peacemaker programs. So we're seeing juvenile peacemaking programs popping up within healing to wellness courts or within the general justice system. We're seeing other diversion programs like community gardens, where they're trying to use creative ways to assist those youth who are going through JJ issues or the justice-involved youth. And on our website, www.nija.org, we've also included some webinars and other distance-based trainings that address things like, the science of addiction, the juvenile brain, and other resources, including things like training and technical assistance for attorneys who are representing either the juveniles and the youth going through the system or other offenders in tribal courts. So we have some additional resources, and oftentimes we work in very close collaboration with the other organizations, including TLPI, Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and the other TA providers for OJJDP. So we all work in coordination to try to provide you the resources that you need. And additionally, this panel is in particular important to us because we believe in the information sharing process. And we know that as TA providers and as attorneys, we can tell you what needs to happen, but you're on the front lines implementing these things, implementing the programs, and you're seeing the issues pop up in real time. So the purpose of the information sharing is to also introduce you to other programs that are doing similar things that you are, so that if you have any questions about a particular program, we can help you identify a resource across the country who's doing something similar, so that we can get you on the phone to talk through problems, through particular issues, and to also just give you another connection and somebody who is an additional layer of support. So the TAJI website, the Tribal Access to Justice Innovation, that's tribaljustice.org, we are collecting promising practices and other innovative practices on that website. And so it's, number one, doing the information sharing, but number two, we're also offering implementation services. So if you're interested in a practice and you don't have a grant already and you want to make that connection or to start building your own programs, we want to be a resource for you as well. But otherwise, I've been really fascinated with all the presentations here, and thank you so much for your time. I really value your guys' input and all of the work that you're putting in to your programs, and we see the work and we definitely recognize the heart that you're putting into your programs and the effect that you're having on the children in your communities. Yes.
Question. Just once again, thank you so much to our presenters coming today. I have a question for both the wonderful presenters, Jessica Passagliacchi, I'm sorry, I butchered your tribe's name, and White Earth as well. What are some best practices? What would make it easier for your programs to either have started when you first started putting them together, to be able to help them flourish, or what is something that you would like to see policy-wise that would make your jobs easier in order to help Native youth within your programs? We'd love to hear that. Thank you.
So I think when we had come together, knowing now, working how we have, there's been just in Indian country or just in organizations, a lot of shifts take place and positions change and agreements that were made or cycles or any type of usual practice either gets developed or dropped. So I would say, if there was anything in the beginning that would have changed, I would have said, initial MOUs or MOAs within the departments to solidify those agreements and to be able to allow the space for those things to take place, regardless of change of positions or funding or whatnot. There was still a commitment to those strategies. I would say that's one for us.
I guess with us, it kind of like they're saying, it's like the changing of your administration, of your people that are running your departments and stuff. And then I don't know if there needs to be something policy driven that says that, that these departments shall work together. Because right now it seems like if one department's doing a little better than the other, they close everything down. The silo starts to rebuild. So then you have to come back and revisit. It seems like you got to revisit that a lot. And it's kind of a waste of time because we all should be on the common goal. Everybody should be working for the same thing. And whether one department's doing a little bit better at one point, it shouldn't matter. And that's the only thing I would really see is that if there is something through either behavioral health or reservation wide that would say, you guys are here to work together. The information that you share, that it's okay, share. That would be something that would be beneficial.
Can I ask a question? So I was very excited that you said that you moved it over to the health side so you could get funding that way, and I just wondered if you could talk about, it sounded easy when you said that you didn't, I wonder if that was difficult. It seems, I've seen some other programs that are funded that way, and especially if we're talking about doing more trauma-informed mental health type care, it should be in the health side, but there's not that many tribes that are doing that successfully, so I wondered if you could talk about how you switched it from.
Actually, she'd be our boss or director of behavior health is the one that pitched that. And the way that she structured it is that our wellness court staff or wellness court case managers supplement what ICW is doing. So we're there to assist their case managers, so we're able to bill at that encounter rate because we're assisting them with their duties. So that's why she made the,
Okay.
That's why she made the switch, or we made that switch, is so that we could supplement and support our ICW, and then we're able to bring the funding back on that. And then the other thing that we did is that we brought everybody under one roof. So when we were moved to behavioral health, I ended up taking over our chemical dependency program for adolescents, and then now we're moving a mental health program underneath that. So we're able to recoup that billing and everything through the delinquency side, the ICW side, and then the mental health side, so we end up getting 3 encounter rates. So, we're all, it's really a complex deal, but when everybody is working together like that, we're able to bill for each one of theirs.
Can you do it without a grant now?
We should be able to function without grant money in the future, yes. So we should be self-sustainable in the future.
And I have another follow-up question related to, collaborating. With the rise of joint jurisdictional courts, like Judge Christine Williams, out of Shingle Springs, where they have a tribal and a state court judge overseeing things like juvenile justice issues. How were you able to work through relationships with the state and the county and the city in a non-tribal way? Did you guys have MOAs in place in advance, or was that something that just kind of happened organically through the process? Because I know you guys mentioned that you don't have any schools on the reservation, so you had to work with the schools, and obviously you're working collaboratively with the county police.
So the Pasquiyaki tribe does have an intergovernmental agreement with TUSD, but it didn't specifically address the attendance achievement program. And one of the things that it did say was that TUSD would share information with the tribe as long as there was a release of information that was signed by a parent, and then those were only good for 1 year. And so the education department, through the voucher program, the clothing voucher program that they have over the summer, would request that parents sign a release of information, but then that parent could revoke that release of information at any point in time. What we did find was that because TUSD was so strapped for resources, when we said, give us our kids back, they were like, sure, just give us the mechanism that will allow us to have that ability to send your children back to you. So because our, like I said, the provision in the law that allowed the school resource officer to get information from the schools would just send the information, the referral, over to our school resource officer or truancy officer, and then that's how information would be filtered to the departments and our prosecutor's office, our education department. And I think the other thing is that all of our Pasquiyaki police officers are also state licensed police officers, so that shared jurisdiction isn't as difficult. But there's not a lot of, like Annette had said, the more formalization that we would have had, I think, would have made things a lot easier. And if TUSD at any point in time would change their mind, they potentially could do that. But because the education department has built such a good relationship with our schools, it allows for that collaboration to take place.
Yes, on our end, we did do a MOU with the state, but the judges ordered right in district court that when the child comes through, if it's a recommendation of the county attorney, they'll instantly make that referral right in state court, put in their court order that they need to complete our wellness court. And then they give us the jurisdiction to be able to work with the kids through that program. And then anything that comes to that, like if he's going to be placed or if the charges are going to be dropped or whatever, everything gets referred back to state, and then state looks at it and will either drop the charges or they'll implement or put them where they need.
Thank you. That definitely highlights the importance of that the relationship building not only needs to happen internally between departments and within the tribe and the leadership and the courts and the police, but also with the counties and the states, the cities, the schools as well. And you had another question? I have one more quick question. Pasca, you are on the Taji website and you have some initial data in, but most of that, of course, is, well, you do have a one anecdotal story, but you do have the numbers. A lot of the time, because our resources are spread so thin, data is oftentimes the last thing we're thinking about, or trying to collect, ask about. Are there other ways that you guys are trying to create, or not create, or I guess create a system for collecting success stories, the qualitative pieces, more of the anecdotal pieces to help support and, bolster what you guys are seeing in practice. Because as we know, the data is what the feds are looking towards. They want to see that you're having an effect in numbers, and we're constantly pushing back as a tribal TA provider, saying, well, yeah, but as we've mentioned, the programs are often running a few years at a time, and sometimes beyond just collecting the numbers, the basic numbers for grant reporting, it's not as in-depth of an inquiry and research endeavor from the outset, only because our resources are already stretched so thin. So do you guys have any suggestions on how you guys have been creating and collecting that data along the way?
So I think one of the most important pieces for us was not just like the collaboration, the multidisciplinary piece of it, but I think data is so important, and part of it was ways for us to influence how the program was running. So for example, one of the things we were tracking was how long does it take the school to refer to us, how many days of school have been missed in that time. Then from the time the police received the citation to the time the prosecutor received the citation, we were tracking like those days, because we could see then how many more days were missed from the time the school sent the citation over to when the prosecutor was entering potentially into a plea agreement to get them over to the attendance achievement program. And by doing that data tracking, we were able to say, okay, it's taking on average 19 days from the referral to get to the prosecutor's office. And by showing that to our chief of police and our prosecutor's office, we moved that from 19 days, I think, to 3 days. And that allows that much more time for us to like intervene with a family and get a kid into school, because sometimes it was simple fixes that would allow us to like start to get the child into school. So that's why I think the data mattered, but we needed that collaboration, because there was no way Annette over at Education could be doing the actual intervention and be doing the data collection at the same time. So one of the things that's kind of fell off, and Annette would say that this has been a challenge, was that I've moved away from the prosecutor's office, and so they didn't have that person that was still doing that data tracking. But it was crucial that those 2 years showed us that this program is successful, and if we are able to go back and collect that data again, we would still, I think, find the same trends exist. And so a lot of what we do have is like the stories of success. So Annette could tell you every family that we've worked with, and she could tell you success, failure, and just issues that we've had. If you want to share like one of our most recent success stories.
Yeah, and I can go into that, but I first want to address that because it is a huge concern, and I don't think it just impacts what you're talking about. It's still a struggle for us, and to understand when people would come to us and to new programs. So how do you know you're successful? And it's like, okay, how do you gauge success in a life, in your life? How would you quantify that, and how would you measure that? And to understand what our goal was not to come in and improve their life. It was to come in and to be able to help them identify what they saw, what they perceived as education, having that cultural approach. And when that paradigm shift, started to take place, people started to understand, okay, so at the end of the day, you could gauge us on absences or more days that students were in school. But when you start looking at the data, and you can go in a rabbit hole of data, and then when we started looking at, well, let's do the year before our program even came into play. What was their life? The absences, any types of things that were taking place. And then after, within the first year, it was like social services, did their calls increase a little bit because families that weren't, being notified, or that connection wasn't being made is now being made. But those numbers don't look positive, but it's kind of like we had to make sure that those things were happening because they were real concerns that were taking place, and to see that those things were happening, or that there was more calls being made, or more truancy referrals being sent. But here's the thing, these numbers simplified something for us. It showed there was more communication happening, and that we were accessing more of the youth that we needed to at that time. So it does make it's very complicated to understand that, and then to see just that time frame. When we were looking, I was telling Johanna, one of the first families we were working with in 2013, I saw last Friday come by my office, and for him to be able to be like, oh, Annette, of course I remember you, and then, to tell me that he was ready to go speak in front of my kiddos that I have now, to listen to her kind of thing, and to understand that there's all of these things that take place, and to see just that overall quantitative data is very valid. And I think one of the things that what we did in the beginning is we did the intake, and with that we added questions about aspirations, about what is education to you, what does that mean to you, and then after the program had taken place and they were completed, we did another exit interview. And that to us helped us identify what they saw and how they perceived education after that, how they perceived the courts, the tribe, and it's like, we weren't here to take you down. This is not why it's restorative justice. This is not what we're here for. It just looks big and scary because you're not used to us coming together the way we do, but this is the way we're working for you. We're all here for you. So understanding that, and then having that perception, to this day, some of these families are still accessing that because that goal was made, but to be able to quantify that in number system, it is a challenge.
Yeah, no, we recognize that, and that's primarily why I asked the question, because it's very similar to the stories that we hear defense counsel saying about, well, recidivism is really difficult because you don't see them when they start. You don't see our clients when they start from where they began. Maybe there's a tiny backslip, but they have made so much progress. And they're like, so how do you show that that's progress, when basically that small backslip means recidivism?
Right.
So, I really love the idea of the interviews, changing your objectives, changing the questions on how, that you asked them as they were coming into the program, because it's not necessarily about, okay, how do we get to 100% school attendance? It was mostly about, well, what do you want? What do you want to achieve in this program? And then the exit interview was also helpful as well. Do you have anything to maybe add about collecting good, successful stories?
I think it kind of, our country is, in Indian countries that we look at, we see where the families are, and you see the gains that the kids have made. And like you were saying, it's hard to show that on paper. You can't go by successful graduations. You can't go by certain things. I mean, the way we see things is if a kid comes through our program, even if they don't successfully complete and they made a little bit of a change to where they're not back involved in law enforcement again, or with law enforcement again, or maybe they made it through the 11th grade instead of the 9th grade. Those are the little things that we got to try to gauge or try to figure out how to track, but it's hard to put a number on that. Yeah. Because technically people don't see that as success.
Yeah, I see it as success, especially being, from my community and seeing similar things, and then also, how do you quantify or even track the success of, a cultural program, which is a larger question that everybody's trying to answer. But, I
Excuse me, I want to jump in again, because I know that to identify what and who is looking, and, what do they identify as success? Because if we're looking, there's a situation that I had just this past year where I was working with a young man, and he ended up, self-identifying, I need to go to rehab, I need to do, again, if you're looking at, some of our kiddos in this program for attendance ended up going to rehab, that might look like kind of like a little flag there, like what's going on? Why are some of your kiddos like kind of having more issues coming in the program than when they had first initial entered? So it's just identifying when somebody's willing to do that. Sometimes we have to, just like construction, you have to break through all these things before we get there, and it just takes time. And some of those things don't look pretty, and we don't see those automatic results. So it's just understanding that whole paradigm of how that shift can take place too. I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and especially when you're looking at the wellness for like this person, an individual, and you're looking at the wellness for the family, and that's sometimes, the programs aren't tracking that either. How is it helping the family at the end of the day? How is it helping that individual, re-enter their community? How is it helping them come back to their community culturally? So I don't know what the answers are, but thank you for your insight. One last question?
Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to throw a quick question to Addie. When you were talking about your research about, there's about 18 juvenile facilities across Indian country that tribes have actually built to house youth who have, had encounters with the law. I was interested in whether or not during your research you had found that the tribes that did build juvenile facilities, if they were also at the same time trying to build programs, tribally appropriate programs, to where they wouldn't have to put youth in those facilities, and that was really the last chance, the last resort for at least violent offenders. Or were these tribes who did build, have the capital to build these facilities, were they using that as their first resort for their youth, since they did build those facilities to house somebody, essentially?
I mean, there's 18 different tribes, so I'm afraid to give an answer, because I'm sure it's different among the tribes, but and the other thing is, so it's interesting to hear that you're doing the data collection. The question I had is, do you just keep it, or do you, so what I see if you go look at the national level for some of these questions is that there are national databases that include states and sometimes federal, sometimes not, but everybody, if you look at FBI statistics or OJDP statistics, they sort of say, well, we don't hear from tribes. So there's a total vacuum as to sort of what's going on with the kids, and each tribe may have their own. Maybe they don't, or maybe it's sent to one of the agencies only, but they're not putting it in the general database. So there's sort of, the only way that I see now is you have to go out to each individual tribe, whether either the tribe has to do it or somebody has to go out and sort of figure out what's happening. So that question is really only answered by going to every one of those 18 communities. And in my experience, when I've worked with tribes, or so even when tribes have requested that, say, my students come in and help revise a code, I can't get a picture of what's happening in terms of law enforcement and juvenile justice until I go. So I actually have to go stand there and say, so when you get a kid, where do they go if they have to go do this? And then they'll explain sort of where that kid goes. But if you're looking at their website to try to figure out the programs, you can't get that kind of picture. So that's a big qualifier to say that I don't feel totally comfortable saying, but my feeling from some of what I've seen is no. And it's not because those tribes don't want other resources, but it just, there's not that many staff on each particular reservation. There's not, there's a shortage of all kinds of resources. So if you marshal them to, if everybody's training to be, it was really interesting to hear from you guys, because one thing is there's a lot of prosecutors and police in Indian country. There's training programs to produce those people. We don't have the same training programs to produce either defense attorneys or anyone who does some other kind of intervention. So if you kind of have, the direction is sort of putting people into jail staffing, for example, then I just think a lot of times structurally you can't possibly invest a lot in any other kind of programming. So like, for example, they'll try to do things like, they have a detention facility, they want to make it a good detention facility, so they bring in this kind of cultural programming you're talking about into the jail. So it's still all being delivered through the jail because that's what they have. And then a lot of times what you get is volunteers. So it's like the website will list all these programs that the tribe has in their detention facility, but that will really depend on a person in the community who volunteers their time, and if that person is not around, they don't do that program. So the money is in sustaining the physical plant of the jail, and they're trying to do the same programming, but I think that it is a rare tribe who has the resources to sort of develop them at all levels. So I don't want to say that nobody does, but it seems like if your resources are limited, you often have to pick one place to start, right? So you pick the wellness court, and then you brought everything into the wellness court. You guys pick truancy. I'm sure you have other programs, but it's like that the resources go into that program. So I like to think about it in terms of the structure, and what I think is that where the structure is driven by the detention facility, that is the mechanism through which all the services are delivered, which means you might still get counseling, but you get it in the jail. And so I guess that's the answer.
Great, thank you.
Can I answer Addie's question? She asked what we did with the data. So one of the things is we share it across our departments, right? So we let them know, like, hey, here's what the attendance achievement program is doing. This is what the data looks like. And then the tribe is now putting together an annual report. And so part of that annual report goes to the community. And so then that's shared also with our community. And then the attendance achievement program, and Annette touched on this very briefly, but it's never been a funded program. So we did have some money for incentives under one of our CTAS grants, and that was used to provide like movie tickets to our kids that were like having perfect attendance. But besides that, the positions are tribally supported positions, and Annette's job actually for the longest time, her title was parent advocate. And so it wasn't until we got Tawahe funding recently that she actually has become the attendance achievement program administrator. So I think one of the things, and we talk about why collaboration is important, is we can also provide a population that is being underserved in our community when we provide referrals into our behavioral health system. And so then they are creating money. And so one of the collaborations that we're doing now is that one of the behavioral health people is working the case management with Annette right now. But that's kind of where the data goes, is it's shared amongst the tribe, and then we did report to the grant, you know, this is what we spent some of our money on, is these incentives for these families.
I do think NCAI might want to consider aggregating the data in some way also. Because it is, right, it's troubling to think about reporting because of the kind of things you talked about to the federal system, which kind of has only certain things that they count, but it does mean that at the national level there's really little, there's only stories, which sometimes are very effective and sometimes they're, you know, if you've just had your program for a year, then your story is just, we're really trying hard, and you don't have the kind of stories that you guys have.
We do have a little bit of their data on the tribaljustice.org website. I'd love to get some more to update that as well, and where we can, and it's not necessarily promising practices, quote unquote, they're innovative practices. So practices where we're receiving referrals, just showing that, you know, there's something good happening in this community, and they, you know, it might only be a couple years in, but they're showing that it's working for those particular purposes. So that's another place that we could put some of your updated numbers and some additional promising, you know, stories, and just, you know, having them both on your site, on your page that's highlighting your practice. All right, I think we are just about out of time. Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you to all the panelists. We really appreciate your time. All right, thank you.